Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today I'm excited to welcome Dr. Martin Erikstad to the show. Martin, welcome.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for having me on your show.
No, super excited to have you on. We're going to be talking all things participation and development within a football or soccer arena. But to get us started, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, my name is Martin Erikstad, as you said. I'm a postdoc at University of Agder in Norway, and my interest in sports psychology started when I did my bachelor degree. We had a really good lecturer in sports psychology. I think I was also fascinated because I could relate to many of the topics through my experience as a youth player. Because at age 17, approximately, I was selected for one of the better under-19 teams in Norway, and things became more serious, more competitive, and it affected how I trained and played, so I could relate to many of the central topics within the sports psychology, such as motivation, stress, and also how coach behaviors influence athletes. So my interest developed, and I went on to do my master degree and later did my PhD on talent development in football at University of Agder under the supervision of Rune Højgaard, Tommy Haugen, and Bjørn Tore Johansen, and also Jean Coté, when I spent a few months at Queen's University in Canada. So first in my PhD, I was interested in understanding the individual athletes, such as the importance of deliberate play and practice. But over time, I became increasingly more interested in how the factors around influence the athlete, such as coach behaviors and group dynamics. So after my PhD, I worked 2 years as an associate professor at Nord University in Bodø, and now I'm back at University of Agder in a postdoc position, where transformational leadership is my main focus of research.
I couldn't help but hear at the beginning of your mini biography there a competitive playing career in football, soccer. And you mentioned there that as you got to the latter stages of, I suppose, developmental elite soccer, you started to feel some pressure, some stress. Tell me a little bit about what you experienced and what happened to your game as a consequence of that.
Yes, so until that, I always played football just for fun,
Okay.
And became like pretty good. So, at least enough to be selected for one of the better teams. I don't think I would have ended up professionally anyway. But yeah, so when I suddenly was not longer the best player on the team, I started being more nervous at practice. So until then, I just focused on my development and enjoying myself. But suddenly, I became more afraid of doing mistakes. And although I tried my best, I've always did that both on practice and matches. But when you're criticized, regardless, that really affected me. So instead of just enjoying football, I started being like more afraid of doing mistakes. So it actually turned out that I got injured. But the day I got injured and was told that you cannot play for several months now, I was pretty relieved actually. So and luckily that was my way into started studying sports instead.
Yeah, really interesting, isn't it? How, I mean, just listening to what you're saying there, it sounded like the narrative underpinning your participation in football, soccer was very much around enjoyment. I love doing this, so I'm going to do it. And it almost, listening to what you said, I do wonder, and this is, I suppose, a question for you, is that did that narrative change towards a greater sense of seriousness and turning down of the volume of fun? Was that an internal and an external thing? External from a coaching point of view of being criticised, but it was also internally in terms of, oh right, this is serious now. This isn't fun anymore. Right, I've got to be taking this mega seriously, and I've got to do things in a different way and in a certain way. Was that the shift of inner story, of inner narrative there at that time?
Yeah, I think Football has always been like really important for me, and it was important for me to perform well earlier as
Mm.
well. But both for myself and I noticed that the environment around me was more centered around performing better. But looking back now, I didn't have like the skills to really reflect on what do I need to do to become better. Like how do I improve my weaknesses? Rather, I just attended practice. I did my very best, and I put in the extra hours, but not necessarily with quality, just running and doing strength training, but not really reflecting on how can I become a really much better football player.
You've mentioned that magic word of environment, the environment around a player, and we touched base on Twitter because you recently led and co-authored a paper, a study entitled "As Many as Possible for as long as possible." Love that
Mm.
term, Martin. As many as possible for as long as possible. A case study of a soccer team that fosters multiple outcomes. As I said, you led and co-authored that paper alongside some pretty big names in our industry. Give me a little bit of a background to this paper. Tell me about the genesis here.
Yeah, so this actually started as a side project back in 2017 or 2018 when I took my PhD,
Okay.
because I became aware of this really interesting team from Bryne, a rather small city on the west coast of Norway. It has a population of about 12,000. And this is the team that Erling Haaland played for, which is, as many would know, one of the best strikers in the world now. But the
I
team,
think the best striker in the world
yeah,
right
yeah, I
now.
agree.
Yeah.
So the team started as a local football team for all boys in the Bryne area at age 6, and it had no entrance requirements. And what I found interesting about this team was that many players at the time looked really promising, and today 6 of the players have obtained a professional football contract, including one of the best striker or the best striker in the world. But at the same time, almost nobody dropped out. So they started with 40 players at age 6, and when they were approximately 18, there were still 35 players left on the team.
Wow.
So while developing really good players, they managed to keep all the kids involved in sport over time. And additionally, one thing that was not so easy to capture, like objectively, was that I heard stories also about this being a group of players that were really nice people. They had like a really positive climate within the group. They were being kind to each others, and they treated opponents with respect and prioritized school. So we want to do a study to better understand what may have led to all these positive outcomes.
40 players at 6 years old. 35 of those 40 still playing, still engaged with the team, with the club at 18. Did you say 6 have gone on to be professional players? Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And just as important to you, the the climate was very positive, respectful, hardworking, cohesive, fostering positive relationships across the team and with coaches as well. That's what I heard you say as well.
Yeah. So develop players, but also people.
Developing players, but also people. So you decided that you wanted to study this. What is going on here that is providing players as many as possible for as long as possible, and I suppose also a term as good as possible as well, with 6 professionals coming out of this group. Well, let's unpack this study. I mean, what frameworks and theories did you lean towards in order to help you understand what was going on here?
So we used a framework called Personal Assets Framework that was developed by Jean Coté and colleagues
Okay.
to better understand how sport can lead to these positive outcomes, and not only sport performance, but also participation and personal development. So Personal Assets Framework suggests that performance, participation, and personal development, that's the long-term outcomes you may experience through sport. But of course, not everyone that starts playing sport experience all these positive outcomes. So we need to look at the dynamic elements of sport to understand why some gets really good, why some continues and other drop out, and why some experience personal development. And according to the framework, our sport experiences and attainment of outcomes are influenced by engagement in activities, the social relationships, and the physical and competitive settings. So it's about what we do, who we do it with, and where we do it.
So, the personal assets framework proposes that there are essentially three P's of sports participation. Performance is in the development of sport expertise, participation itself, so engagement in sport or physical activity throughout life, so a lifetime engagement in sport, and then
Yeah.
personal development. I suppose we're talking here healthy psychological, social, and emotional development,
Yeah.
and that there are drivers that can lead to these outcomes.
Yeah.
That being personal engagement in activities, quality social dynamics, and appropriate physical and competitive settings. And so this is the framework that you use to study this small club in Norway.
Yeah, so because we saw that the outcomes obtained by this team, it really aligns well with the personal assets framework. Like they developed really good players. They got the children to stay involved in sports over time, and they developed people. So you had all the three P's: performance, participation, and personal development. So yeah, we want to wrap up what they did of activities, the social dynamics, and the settings.
It feels like an impenetrable sweet spot, Martin. I'm picturing participation, performance, and personal development as some kind of triangle on a PowerPoint presentation. And to hit all three feels like this sweet spot that, I don't know, kind of small or difficult to attain. But it sounds like it does actually exist.
Yeah, and I think when you, at least in Norway, when we start playing sports, that's the outcome we want to obtain. But especially when we get older, I think sport typically focus on the performance aspect from we
Mm.
starting at the youth. But yeah, I think this is a really good example that you can still obtain all the three P's through sport.
Is there something about the social cultural dynamics within Norwegian society, or specifically within Norwegian sport, that lends itself or leans more towards participation at younger levels and oriented towards this sweet spot?
Yeah. So Norwegian football or sport in general has really high participation rates, and some of it is probably due to we have some regulations to avoid early specialization and exposing children to intense competition.
Okay.
So for instance, there's not allowed to have result-based prizes or national competitions for athletes under 13, and we don't select players at a very early age. So children's sport in Norway is always organized as grassroots sports where everybody is allowed to participate.
And is that philosophy part of the personal assets framework? In as much as there feels like a bit of a dichotomy between early specialization and early sampling. Uh, that they seem to be separate and just can't join.
Yes, so in Norway, we really promote the early sampling and that not many will end up as professional athletes. So I think that the main goal for Norway is that sport is a healthy social arena for children. So it's more about participation and personal development. But you see that this is not hindering the development of performance either.
And I'm sure we'll explore this more as we unpack this study and as you got to learn about this small club, this small soccer club. Can the same be said for winter sports in Norway? Because I suppose, I mean, now Erling Haaland and others have hit the scene in Norwegian football. This might be a golden era from an outcome perspective in World Cups and European Championships, perhaps. There might be a great deal of success there. I suppose when I think of Norwegian sport, I think of the incredible success you have in winter sports, Norway has in winter sports. Um, Can the same philosophies be said of winter sports in Norway?
Yeah, and I think that most of our athletes have pretty much the same developmental pathway, that
Right.
they started playing sports just for fun in the early years, and especially winter sport athletes, they played a lot of different sports. And I think there was a study showing that until early teens, most of them just played sport because of it. It was really fun, and made a quite late choice that this is the thing I want to do and become the best at. Yeah, we do things maybe a little bit different. So sport is just for fun in the early years, and it seems like that lays a foundation for later specializing and putting in all those hours with quality practice that is required. And of course, we have a culture and climate that really appreciate winter sport.
I'm thinking of people listening in and considering the complexity of what you're talking about, because I'm thinking about the young participant in the middle, the teenage participant who starts to explore their development, and then the participant who starts entering the competitive arena in perhaps their mid to late teenage years. And I'm thinking about familial presence. I'm thinking about coach and teammate influences. Um, those influences make that landscape quite complex. No, it's not just as simple as saying, well, hey, we're just going to participate for fun, and then we're just going to move on to something that's a little bit more developmental as we ramp up the seriousness here, and then we flick the switch, and then we're, into competitive play and very serious. There's so many influences around a participant that it feels like Norway have arrived at this sweet spot. And I'm sure there's nuance and complexity here, but it feels like Norwegian sport has arrived at this sweet spot. But it's complex, right? And it's got to be complex for other societies.
Yes, and I think when the Norwegian system is also vulnerable because we rely on parents coaching the children
Okay.
on a voluntarily basis. That's like the main thing for coaches in Norway. And if you look at all these athletes coming up that are winning at the highest level, very many of them have parents that have been hugely influential in their career. So we need to make sure that it's not randomly up to whether an athlete has that type of parents or not. So there are challenges within the Norwegian system as well, and perhaps especially regarding quality coaches.
Let's try to unpack this study. So you've got your frameworks in place, specifically the personal assets framework, in order to investigate what was going on or what's been going on. You've got this incredible model of a club. So unpack the study for me. How did you go about investigating this club? Who did you interview? Broaden this for me. Tell me more about this.
Yes, so it started with I made contact with the coach, and he told me more about this team, and I was really fascinated and just asked if we can do a case study of the team. So he helped us with getting access to the players and parents. Uh, so we asked, can you provide the people that can help us understand this environment as good as possible? So we interviewed 4 parents, we interviewed 4 players, 1 staff at the Bryne Football Club, and we also interviewed Alf Yngve Berntsen himself, which was the head coach. And we asked about 2 players that have progressed to play professionally and 2 players that just played for fun, to make sure we got both sides covered there. And the same for parents. So because they had to remember like several years back, we also used something called the timeline methodology. So we made them draw like a line back to when they started playing football at about 6. So to facilitate recall about who was the important persons at different time points, what were their milestones, and how much did they practice or engage in other activities. And it also turned out that the coach had kept training diaries from the very beginning. So
Oh, wow.
he really documented both the amount and also the content of what happened within the organized practice. So we also got access and analyzed the training diaries.
So you interviewed parents, coaches, players, some players, a couple of players who went on to professional, a couple of players who play for fun, still play for fun. I'm guessing out of a thematic analysis, themes emerged. What themes were they?
Yes, so we had a rather deductive approach for like the personal assets framework, so the big picture there, but within these dynamic elements, there were sub-themes that emerged. So
Okay.
one thing is that regarding activities, they didn't play very much organized football during early years until age 10.
Oh, wow.
They had 1 to 2 organized practice sessions of 60 minutes each. However, the quality was really good, but the amount was quite low compared to many other teams. So it was also 50% small sided games, and the players emphasized that it was really fun during organized practice. But what also became clear was that they spent a lot of time playing football just for fun. So when they were quite early in the early years, a local football dome was built on Bryne. So that's more part of the settings, but contribute to understand why they played so much. So the dome is really interesting and shows how important appropriate settings may be to understand activity involvement.
Yeah.
Because this dome was built when Erling and the other was a few years old. It had
Okay.
artificial turf, and it was centrally located in Bryne, where all players had access within like 5 minutes walk or cycling, and it was open 24/7. And you don't get that in big cities, but at Bryne, the dome was open for just playing football. And I don't know if you've been in Norway during the winter periods, but it's not always easy to play football on a nice field. So this dome has been really important. And one of the parents we talked to said that the group of boys here was practically raised in that dome.
It's amazing, isn't it, how facilities structure influences what people do and how they perceive what they do, and having the capacity there to practice more and practice more for fun, play for fun, obviously was a heavy mediator in terms of
Yeah.
engagement. I just want to just reinforce some of the messages here around activity. So what I heard you say was that prior to 10 years old, there was very little organized practice, 1 to 2 60-minute sessions
Yes.
a week. And of those 60-minute sessions, 50% were small sided
Yeah.
games. And obviously, when we think of small sided games, we're thinking of optimizing player
Yeah.
engagement. So that was particular to that club. There are obviously other clubs who would, in the area or in adjoining areas, who were doing more organised practice, but particular to this club was a low level of organised practice prior to 10 years old. After 10 years old?
Yeah, so then they started playing organized like 2 to 3 times a week. But from age 13, they were divided into 2 groups. There were one group that trained 2 times each week,
Okay.
and one group that trained 4 to 5 times each week. And that is what pretty common in Norway, that you kind of create a first team and second team, but they did it a little bit different here because distribution of the players across the team was not based on the coach selecting the best players on the first team. Rather, the players decided for themselves how many practice sessions they wanted to have weekly, because the coach saw that there were variations within the group. Some wanted to practice a lot, some wanted to practice just a couple of times a week.
Wow.
So that's different than what we normally do in Norway. but they also made sure that they shared training hours, meaning that Erling and the other players that were really good still could cycle to training with their friends that were not that good or just wanted to play for fun 2 times a week. And they could still share the wardrobe and warm up together. So that was in terms of the amount, but the coaches and players also emphasized that the quality was still really good, both for the more recreational group, but also for the elite group.
That's really interesting. So, Erling Haaland and his contemporaries who have gone on to play in the professional game obviously chose a real autonomy supportive feel here. Obviously, we're given the option to choose: do you want to have organized practice more or less, 2 or around about 4 times a week? They were able to choose what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
And also subsequently, they also had the opportunity to train together. So for those who chose 2 times a week, they would still be training alongside Erling and, the players who were, let's use the term serious here, were really serious about pushing on their game. It was a little bit more than just fun. It was still fun to them, but it was a bit more than that. There was a searching for a little bit more, is kind of what I'm hearing. But they still participated together. Yeah. So here might be examples of players who chose more, were more serious, but still trained with young people who were less serious about their game and more fun oriented, but it didn't damage their participation or their learning or competitiveness, seemingly.
Yeah. So, and the coach said that he didn't want to tell a player that really loved football that you're not so good, so you're not allowed to train 4 times a week. And also the opposite, that if there was a really good player but just wanted to play 2 times a week for fun, that's probably the best for that player to just train 2 times a week. And also to understand why so many continued playing sport over time. They said that this more recreational group, although they trained just 2 hours, they were taken seriously. So often you see that in Norway, that when children say, I just want to do this for fun, things are not that properly organized. And the players we interviewed said that other teams made a big fuss about being the reserve team and they were not taken serious. And then people dropped out. But on this Bryne team, they were taken seriously. The training sessions were properly organized. They had a match plan and so on. But the amount was more in accordance with their interest, but they were taken seriously.
What about matches and tournaments, Martin? What was the attitude towards those?
Yes, so in the early years, like in children's sport from 6 to 12 years, there were always equal playing time, and the coach said that his goal was to create as equally strengthened teams as possible. But also when they entered youth football, they continued with equal distribution of playing time. So rather than putting Erling and the other future elite players, letting them play all the matches, everybody should play. I think it was at least 1/2 of the match.
Wow. Okay. And as they grew older, were there more opportunities to play matches? Was it more selective?
Yes. So when they got older, they entered certain competitions. So they always wanted to enter tournaments where both the elite and the recreational team could travel together. But the elite team also entered some tournament, I think, that were more competitive. But there's also an interesting story from the last match of the season. I don't think that was included in the paper, but when they were like 14, I think, they had 2 teams in the same league. And before the final game, one of the teams were on top of the league with another team, Viking, chasing. And for the final match, the two Bryne teams, they met. So everybody thought that Bryne would make sure they won the league. But the coaches here had a principle that they tried to make the two teams equally strong.
Okay.
And they did that throughout the whole season, but they also did it for the final match. And in the final match, I think it ended as a draw, but the result was that Viking were winning the league
Oh,
because following the principles was more important for the coaches than winning the league.
Yeah. In terms of principles, I mean, with relation to outcomes, I mean, were activities put on by coaches quite syllabus oriented? How were players involved in any of that syllabus or involved in session design at all? You know, what was the dynamic between players and coaches with relation to sort of long-term outcomes and objectives?
So not sure how much of like the practice amount, or we talked about the amount that the players chose for themselves, but I'm not sure to what degree they chose the content. But I know he had a really positive relationship with all the players, so he knew them, and the training was really in accordance with their interests. So first he had really like football competence to coach Alf Yngve Berntzen. He had played at a pretty good level as a youth athlete or player himself.
Yeah.
And he also has a UEFA license, which is the second highest coaching certificate. But what the players and parents talked about most was his social skills and his ability to develop positive relationships to all players and to see in everybody. So the way the parents and players described him really aligns with transformational leadership here.
Let's unpack that. I think we're moving neatly onto another theme here. I mean, we've spoken about the theme of outcomes, we've spoken about the theme of activities. Now we're moving on to the theme of social relationships, and obviously all these themes intertwine, but you've used that magical term, transformational leadership. And just to say to everybody listening in, we have spoken about transformational leadership on the Sports Psych Show before. Stefan Deary and Dr. Carl Paradis in episode 207, and then episode 92 with Jennifer Lace. But I know that transformational leadership is an interest of yours, and it's obviously something you saw from the head coach of this team. So what did the study demonstrate in terms of transformational leadership?
So I think really what this study adds is perhaps a better understanding about what is transformational leadership for coaches in their like everyday life or coaching.
Okay.
So like transformational leadership broadly, it's a leadership style with behaviors that empower, inspire, and challenge followers. So it enables them to reach their potential, and the behaviors of transformational leadership is connected to the 4 I's of idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. So when we interviewed the players and the parents, they told stories that really aligned with these 4 I's of transformational leadership. So idealized influence, it's about gaining followers' trust by doing what's right rather than what's convenient. So basically being a good role model. And that was in line with their description of him. For instance, if somebody did a mistake, he invited them to talk. He didn't yell at them. So he was showing like pro-social behaviors. Inspirational motivation, it is about holding high expectations and enhancing followers' perceptions of their capabilities. And a key message here is believe in your athlete. Intellectual stimulation is about making your athletes involved and make them take leadership responsibilities and make them contribute with ideas. And one story from one of the players, he talked about a match they played where they faced this striker they couldn't handle. And at halftime, they asked the coach how to deal with the striker. And the coach, Alfie, responded, I know how you can handle the striker, but I want you to figure it out yourself. So learning from the situation was more important than winning. And the coach really challenged the players all the time. And the final component is individualized consideration. It's about recognizing individual needs and providing genuine care and concern for your athlete. And that was perhaps the most like prominent characteristics when they described him. I have a story about that one too from the paper if you want to hear.
Please, yeah.
So one of the parents said that the head coach, he was crazy about seeing all boys and make sure he interacted with all the players each practice session. And when I talked with the coach, he elaborated on that, and I don't remember it exactly, but he said something like, "We know how important it is to be seen as a person. Opposite, the worst feeling is when you are being ignored. That's perhaps the worst form of bullying, being ignored." So one of the things he did was that he did not take notes on which player had attended the practice session or not, which is common to do in Norway at least. So instead, he wrote down the name of all the players that had attended the session when they came home. So if there was a player he was not sure had attended the practice session or not, he said that he had to make sure that he had a positive interaction with that player the next session, because we know how important it is to be seen as a person. And how can I say that I have seen that player if I even can't tell if he was there?
What a fantastic story. And as you're speaking there, it makes me think of the enormous challenge for coaches. Coaches are people, they're human beings, and often they get into coaching because they love the sport. They've played the sport that they want to coach. They love the sport that they want to coach. And when they get into coaching, it's a learning experience to recognize that this is about people rather than, or people more so than the sport that you're coaching. It's not to suggest that it's not about the sport that you're coaching. And as you've mentioned there, this coach has a UEFA A license, is an expert in the game, has high competence, a high professional knowledge. And you actually break this down in a table in the study, which I'd recommend everybody reads. But it's recognizing, for me to be able to, as a coach, for me to be able to elicit from my players what I want them to learn, improve upon, what I want them to experience, I have to put the person, I probably have to put the person first. I have to be a people person, as you say. I have my leadership, transformational leadership is such a great leadership model for sports coaching, because it is about getting down to the ground level with the players, isn't it? And about establishing those relationships, being inspiring, but also alongside intellectually stimulating the players from a game perspective.
Yeah, and when I attend coach seminars, for instance, we see these drills or ideas about how we should play, and I think it's fascinating because then we all take notes. What can we learn from these game principles? But when we talk about the more relational aspect of coaching, we all agree that that's really important, but somehow we don't really get that interest triggered in how can we become better at this. So I would love seeing us coaches also taking notes from what can we do on the relational aspect of coaching that make us better interact with our players, because that's very often when we think of the best coaches we ever had, very often they have been great on the professional side, but very often it's also because they established really positive relationship with us.
Fascinating stuff. So I suppose moving on to the discursive side of this, what were your, when you sat down to write the discussion in this piece, what did you write here? What did you think was important to get across to the reader?
So first, I think it's a really unique case that shows that it is really possible to develop really good players while also um, maintaining the the rest of the players within the sport over time, and also developing people. So that's a key point, because previous studies have tended to focus on one of the piece. For instance, this is how you can develop really good athletes. So that's perhaps one key message that we wanted to say, and this is complex. So we wanted to talk about the activities, what they did, and there it really fits well with current recommendations, I would say, about avoiding early specialization and promoting play for children, but also
Mm.
the importance of quality practice, both for at young age, but also throughout development. But it was also important to emphasize that to understand why children engage in sport, why they love the sport, we need to also see at the social relationships. So we used some time to describe the climate within the group and discuss that in light of such as cohesion, and the coach was highly influential as well. So we discussed his behaviors up against transformational leadership. And also, we discussed the importance of settings, both the access to facilities, but also the culture at Bryne, because this is it's not by chance perhaps that this is where Arling is from, or why this was so good, because Bryne is also a football place. So the people living in Bryne, um, they really love football. They're hardworking people, and the male senior team have traditionally performed well. So that made it really natural for all these boys to start playing football. And they also had access to proximal role models. So, for instance, Erling's father, Alfie Haaland, he played for Leeds United and Manchester City and the Norwegian national team. So
Yep.
that also
Yep.
made it like the players saw that you can come from Bryne and you can become a really good player. So it's possible to come from here and make it at the highest level. So that was what we at least tried to do, to grasp like the complexity and show what they have done, and it really is, I would say, in accordance with what we already know about what are like clever to optimize development as well as promoting participation and personal development. But as I said, I think it shows how this can be put into practice.
Interesting listening to you there, Martin, because it gives me images of a community that is serious about football, hardworking, but flexible enough to understand that within a talent pathway or developmental pathway, that there are going to be individual differences. That
Mm.
not just from a talent perspective, but also ability perspective, but also from an attitudinal perspective and an outcome orientation perspective. That yes, we
Mm.
might love football and we might be serious about football. We might want our young people to work hard or to practice hard. It might be a better term when they go and engage with football. But we also want we want to give them choice. We want to give them an
Mm.
appropriate psychosocial foundation as possible, and provide them with choice, autonomy to make decisions about the pathway that they want to take. Those are the kind of
Mm.
messages I'm hearing, and again, a tough sweet spot to find. And there may even be some
Mm.
dissenters within the mix, but the outcomes demonstrate a keen mix of lifelong participants and professional participants, professional competitors. So it seems to be. I think we need to be careful when we talk about things working and not working, and there's probably a continuum there, but it
Mm.
seems to be a very positive climate, no question. But just some thoughts.
Yeah, and the coaches was very clear that they were parent coaches, so they said that the likelihood of ending up as a professional player is really small. But regardless, we may not develop professional players, but this should just be a really positive environment for our local boys. But so that was the most important part. And when we asked the players, also the coaches told about, they developed this vision for the team, as many as possible, for as long as possible, and as good as possible. but they really talked about keeping as many as possible for as long as possible. That was the head coach's goal with the team.
As many as possible, as long as possible, over and above as good as possible. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that was what they really emphasized. Of course, they were serious about football. They tried to become better, but like the most important was keeping this as many as players for as long as possible, having that as a positive arena.
What's your thoughts? I suppose I'm going to ask for an opinion here. There are many people listening from many different cultures within different contexts. Do you think you can take this from this small town in Norway and scatter it globally to influence the development of players in other cultures, in other contexts? Do you think that's possible? Do you think it can just be copied? Do you think it has to be, do you think other considerations have to be accounted for? Do you think you can take bits and pieces of this? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a big and interesting question. Well, first, I think if we took this and tried to copy it another place in the world, you probably wouldn't have the same outcomes, because there are so many there's so many aspects to it.
Yes.
So, for instance, would the coaches both have the same? Okay, you need to make sure you get a coach that both have really high football competence, but also have the same view on what's important here for these kids. Another thing that we didn't really discuss much in the paper was parents, because we see that parents in a group is very influential. And they talked about in this case that they quickly got the parents on board. But my experience from other clubs, that if we say that we should have equal distribution of playing time in youth football, many parents would probably argue and not work together with coaches, perhaps work against coaches. So there are definitely challenges in implementing this system in other place, perhaps especially if it's very performance oriented, that they may think this is a too kind system, perhaps. But I think that regardless, that everyone probably has something to learn from this case. If we're involved in children or youth sport, either that's transformational leadership that we really want to look into, maybe the importance of having a place to just play football because it's fun and social, but it's also a great arena to become better. Maybe you can be informed about how to organize children's sport to promote like continued participation over time. So yeah, I think there are definitely things we can learn from this case study, regardless of where we are. But I don't think we could copy it and expect the same outcome overall.
I think that's pretty fair. Martin. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. What's next for you? Where are you going with your research projects next?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, my postdoc is into transformational leadership, and that was inspired by both Jean Coté has done some really influential work, and also this. I've been inspired by this Bryne coach to both understand more about transformational leadership, but also how can we perhaps influence coaches. So we are currently working on developing a scale for measuring transformational leadership that can be both used for research but also for coaches or clubs. So that's one project we're working on, and we also are working with Jean Coté and the environment in Canada on transformational leadership, and how can we influence coaches to do more of the things we see is really positive that coaches do.
Sounds like a follow-up to this episode. Absolutely fascinating. Well, Martin, I can't thank you enough. I mean, it's just brilliant, brilliant research that we can all learn from. And I really enjoyed unpacking that study. And I know you will have tapped the interest of the Sports Psych Show audience. It's open access, the paper, actually, which is just superb. How can people look? Firstly, how can people get hold of that paper, and how can people follow you? Do you use social media, and how can people get in contact if they'd like to?
Yeah, so the paper is published in the Sports Psychologist, and well, at the time we published it, we saw that Erling Haaland was becoming pretty good, so we understood that this could get some attention, so we decided to make it open access.
Yeah.
So the title of the paper is "As Many as Possible for as Long as Possible." I think you will find it by Googling that, or go within
Yes.
the Sports Psychologist page. So, and through my institution, University of Agder, I'm available. You can find my contact info there. So, for people to make a call or send me an email. And I'm also on Twitter. I'm not very active, but I'll be happy for a follow when I will answer if I can.
And do you know what your handle is on Twitter?
Erikstad, I think.
Okay, so it's at Erikstad, Erikstad, at Erikstad, to follow you on Twitter, which is you've got a great timeline where you release all of the details of your work. Martin, that's just been absolutely fascinating. And last thing for me, I love the way you modestly downplay Erling Haaland, who is just an incredible player. I mean, he's shot onto the scene. There were a lot of people, I think, in Premier League circles who weren't too sure how successful he was going to be in the Premier League, and he's proved those naysayers wrong 10 times over. He's just in Norway. You guys must be so proud of him.
Yeah, and I think it's also really cool when you see all these fancy academies around the world that like select the best players from a really young age, provide professional coaches, and they take them out of their home environment maybe. And then you suddenly see that the best striker in the world comes from a completely different background. And I'm not against academies, many of them are great, but I think it's a really fascinating stories. And yeah, people in Norway are very proud of him, and I see kids on the local soccer fields, they are running around now in blue jerseys with Haaland on his back. So I know a lot of young people are inspired by him as well.
Well, I think to speak to that just before we finish, I think I completely agree with you. Nobody would downplay any of the great work that the big academies do, and their care for their players and their people. I personally believe now is absolutely central to what they do. It is challenging for any big academy to manage all of the people who are involved in their academy, but possible. But what it does for me, Martin, is it says we have to continue to ask questions. We have to continue to be curious about development. We can always look at a case study of one and draw assumptions from that case study of one. But I think what's really fascinating about your research is that, there are 6 players who have gone professional, and there were 35 players who stayed the course. So that is a demonstration. I mean, hey, look, it might be, again, one study, or it might be a brief period of time where this all came to fruition and it's successful, and it might not be replicable. But I believe it will be, and we have to continue to be curious about that and what the implications for other development pathways or talent development pathways are, what it means for the bigger academies, the smaller academies, the global academies, the local academy. What does this mean? That's kind of how I perceive this.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that regardless of whether it's an academy or a local soccer club, that friendship and play, those sorts of things will still be important components of a successful sport environment for children. That's something we can all agree on probably, but just perhaps sometimes we forget it and makes the sport a little bit too serious too early.
Yes, absolutely. Well said. Well, Martin, I can't thank you enough for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. It's been great talking to you.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. I'd be delighted to hear any suggestions that you may have. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.